thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, MEP, Samira Rafaela, Jafar, and Kyla for being here with us today. And Joe Dunn, if you would like to say a few words to start us off, please.
Thank you very much, Bianca. I hope you can all hear me. I'm the Director of the European Parliament Liaison Office in Washington. Our job is to foster relations between the European Parliament and the US Congress, but we have a second very important job of reaching out to the very important population of students of EU and EU policies in the United States. And in that capacity, we've been partnering with the European Horizons since the very first European Student Conference in 2015 at Yale University. And we love your passion, we love your energy and contribution, and we're really very happy to be sharing this event with you. And in the context of our relations with the Congress, we've been encouraging dialogue on many subjects, but we've recently, particularly since the death of George Floyd and the, I think, very important landmark resolution in the European Parliament in July, we have been encouraging dialogue on racial equity, equality, and justice. And we had, I think, a landmark joint meeting between the Helsinki Commission in the US Congress and the Subcommittee on Human Rights in the European Parliament. Our colleague MEP Samira Rafaela spoke in that debate. So we're delighted that she's able to join us today to talk in the discussion. I think she symbolizes the all the good, what's good about Europe in this respect, and how important it is to combat racism and systemic discrimination in all our societies. So I'll hand back to you. Very happy that we can play a small part in setting up and promoting a regular exchange of views between elected representatives and stakeholders and students like yourselves.
Thank you very much. That's very well said. So with that, I will introduce all of our panelists today. My name is Bianca Hurlery, and I am the Director of North American Chapters with European Horizons, moderating the panel. And we are delighted to be joined today by a member of European Parliament, Ms. Samira Rafaela. Samira Rafaela is a Dutch member of the European Parliament for the Social Liberal political party D66. As such, she is part of the Renew Europe group. She was elected to the European Parliament in May 2019. In the European Parliament, Ms. Rafaela is co-president of the European Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup. She is a member of the Committee on International Trade and the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. She is also a substitute member in the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs. In the Eurolat delegation, Ms. Rafaela serves as the first vice president of the Committee on Economic, Financial, and Commercial Affairs. Prior to her election to the European Parliament, she advised the Dutch police force on inclusion and diversity. I am also joined by two of my colleagues at European Horizons. First, we have Kyla Terry. Kyla is a second-year MA candidate in the German and European Studies program at Georgetown University, with a concentration in migration, diplomacy, and asylum policy. She co-chairs the BMW Center's Transatlantic Policy Symposium and is the co-president of UH Georgetown. She is also the vice president of Georgetown's Black Graduate Student Association. Kyla worked as a graduate research assistant for the Institute for the Study of International Migration, the Mortara Center for International Studies and Migration Policy Institute in her first year. Kyla's experience with combating systemic racism is extensive and is represented by her commitment to ensuring that Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color are accurately represented in higher education and within the field of international affairs. Then we are joined by Jafar Latif. He is a final year philosophy, politics, and economics student at UCL. He is interested in topics regarding the ethics of punishment, international development, and climate justice. For his undergraduate dissertation, Jafar is conducting a discourse analysis of how the media in developing nations present issues of development and sustainability. by showing how discourses shape the narrative which policymakers operate within. He hopes to highlight how this can facilitate systemic racism. Outside of his studies, Jafar is a policy coordinator for European Horizons and helps organize and run policy workshops. He is passionate about combating systemic racism within European policymaking and within the sphere of international development. So we will begin this panel with 20 to 25-minute discussion between us all, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So to start this off, I would like to ask each of our panelists just one opening question. And this is, how do you see systemic racism materialize in your own country? And Ms. Rafaela, if you would like to start us off.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for having this meeting, and also thank you to both of you in the kind words. So first of all, it's so extremely important that we understand that racism has no borders, and we need to work on coalitions across borders, coalitions in the world to combat and fight racism. We cannot do that on our own. Too many people daily are being affected because of racism, discrimination, and exclusion in our society. But even also in the organizations and the own institutions that we work in or that people deal with. And for me, racism and discrimination is one of the most important priorities in the European Parliament to work on, because I can tell from my experience also, I used to work for the Netherlands Police and the Commissioner's staff. I advised on inclusion and exclusion in society, and I know from my career before the European Parliament that if you are not making sure that people get equal opportunities in terms of social opportunities, but also economic opportunities, that this can clearly work out negative for our societies as a whole. And often people ask me like, oh, but why do you want to touch upon the topic so often, and why do we need to speak about discrimination and racism a lot? And I always explain to people that if we want to live in a peaceful world, then it's very important that people feel accepted and that they can participate equally. So when it comes to what I've seen, for example, in my own member state, in the Netherlands, is that we have so many diverse identities living in the Netherlands, and that's something that we can be proud of. But I also know from my work at the Netherlands Police that there are difficulties in terms of connecting and communicating with certain communities in society, because they feel excluded, they feel discriminated, they don't get the equal opportunities. And it's not only a matter of feeling, it's also that we have statistics, that we have researchers and all kinds of documenting, proving that people are being discriminated. And I'm very glad that the European Union recently, specifically the European Commission, launched an action plan against racism, where they will hold member states to account. So there comes a very important element. The anti-racism action plan of the European Union was clearly a response and answer to what happened with George Floyd. It was an answer to the strong messages that the Black Lives Matter movement gave through all the demonstrations worldwide. And it was also an answer to, I believe, all the work that the members of the European Parliament have been doing on the topic. And I'm glad to be the co-president of the anti-racism and diversity intergroup, because before this action plan, we could have several meetings with the European Commission and raise very, very important points. And it all started with a resolution after George Floyd that we voted on in the European Parliament, that we worked on, and then actually the action plan came. So what I would like to end my answer with, that the member states will need to propose a national action plan, and in this plan there's a framework that will be that will be touched upon, and that framework comes from the European Commission in the first place, and then in the second place, the member states need to come up with their own measures and with their own specific priorities, making sure that on a national level, racism is being combated. But you know, we should not do it only on the national level. We should also do it transatlantic and with more coalitions in the world.
Thank you. And I'll pass that over to Kyla, please, who is based in the United States.
Yes, hi, thank you for having me. So systemic racism exists in many and several forms within the US. For example, America's housing system consistently undermines wealth building and community of colors and designates them to poorer and less environmentally safe areas. And this is often known as environmental racism. Racism also exists in higher education and is represented, one, in a curriculum where there's a lack of professors, a lack of Black and Brown scholars within actual syllabi, the number of admissions, especially in STEM areas, and several other aspects. There's also a climate within institutions of higher education where students of color feel unwelcome and that they did not deserve nor earn their spot at the university. And systemic racism also exists in the US penal system, law enforcement policies, labor markets, and other places that denies American citizens, American Black citizens, access to the livelihoods and opportunities of white counterparts. From my personal experience, which is what I think I was also brought here for, I can attest to the several ways in which my identity as a Black woman has prevented me from accessing certain parts of livelihoods that I feel like Americans are and should be granted. See our Constitution. But I will say that there has been progress, but progress for the sake of progress isn't progress at all. So I'm actually looking forward to the ways in which the George Floyd protests and even events across the Atlantic will change US systems towards its Black citizens.
Thank you so much, Kyla. And Jafar, who's based in the United Kingdom.
So from a United Kingdom perspective, I think systemic racism is, again, very similarly present in a lot of stages of society, whether it be education. I think one of the key ways in education it manifests is that Black and students, as well as brown students, are often predicted lower grades than their white counterparts, which in turn affects their ability to apply for top universities. This was a particularly big problem this year, considering a lot of students had to apply based on predicted grades. So that's one form of issue. A second form could be within policing, the fact that young Black men are more likely to receive harsher punishments for the same crimes that their white counterparts will do. And thirdly, I think the whole discourse around colonialism in the United Kingdom, colonialism is a big part of British history. And often as a child, when you grow up and you go through education in the UK, colonialism is either glorified or just brushed over. There's very little conversation about the horrors of colonialism, and instead, as a person of color, you just see yourself in history as an oppressed being, as someone who has never achieved anything great, and that manifests within the attitudes amongst teachers, amongst members of society, which in turn, really affects the opportunities available to people of color. And even when they try to go for the same opportunities, they have additional barriers to get to the position where they want to be. So I think systemic racism, again, very similar to the way that Samira and Kyle have highlighted in their own nations, is very much present in the United Kingdom. The biggest issue is, I think, how people really try to gloss over it, or they don't want to call a spade and rather call it other issues.
Thank you, Jafar. Yeah, and I really appreciate it as well, already mentioning transatlanticism and maybe how we can take a transatlantic approach to combating the systemic racism. So, Ms. Raphael, a question for you. As von der Leyen has said in her State of the Union address, now is the time to build a truly anti-racist union, going from condemnation to action. So I want to ask you, what are these actions and how does Europe build such an anti-racist union?
Yes, thank you so much. So I already shortly mentioned that this anti-racism action plan was being launched. And I think that it's a comprehensive plan in which the European Commission already decided to be more specific on given specific topics. So, for example, the European Commission said that it will review existing anti-racism and discrimination legislation, and that based on these reviews, they will decide whether the member states whether the member states did enough to implement the legislation. I think that's very strong. That's one of the strongest points of the action plan, because legislation is very powerful. It's a powerful instrument to making sure that people are being protected in their fundamental rights. So I'm very curious, of course, about what the outcome of this monitoring will be. And as a member of European Parliament, I will definitely raise questions and follow it very closely to see what the outcome is. They even announced that if they conclude that member states did not comply enough to the already existing legislation, that they are willing to start infringement procedures. That's a very heavy instrument that the European Commission has against member states. Also, the European Commission decided that it will organize a summit against racism with the involvement of EU institutions, member states, and civil society, equality bodies, and grassroots organizations. They also called upon the member states to organize and implement equality bodies. I think that's very good, because then you can also take into account the national level. You can make sure that documenting and gathering of data is being covered. And what we also said as the Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup, what we said a lot to the European Commission is that they need to work with civil society organizations. It cannot be that they make plans, that they do all these policies, they make new legislation without consulting the civil society. So it's very strong that they said also in the plan that they will have different roundtables with civil society organizations, and they will even appoint a coordinator for anti-racism who will also be responsible for having the connection with the communities in Europe and with the civil society organizations, and then bringing that back to the drawing table and making sure that the Commissioner and the European Commission is doing the right thing. It will also do work on itself. I had a lot of critics on diversity and inclusion in our own EU institutions, and I keep repeating that. I think it's strong about the action plan that they said that they will undertake measures to change the recruitment and selection procedures, and making sure that they will have more staff in the EU institutions with a diverse background. Because, like I always say, I mentioned that a couple of times already in my interventions in the plenary debates, is that you can have all these great plans, but if you don't have the right people raising the right questions in your own institutions, you can just not make it work. And that's exactly why we see the gaps existing in legislation. They also said in the action plan, and that's actually one of my most important topics when it comes to targeting racism and discrimination nowadays, that's to ensure that the legislative framework on artificial intelligence will specifically address the risk of biases and discrimination building into these systems. So think about the data sets that are being used, how they are being used, and especially when they are being used for recruitment and selection. I mean, there you go already. And they also said that they will combat racism and discrimination in other areas such as education, making sure that they making programs to fight stereotypes, specifically also to fight Islamophobia, and making sure that other narratives and other stories are being told, so that a better image exists and a better understanding of different people with different backgrounds. And again, like I said, they will call upon the member states to make a national action plan. And what's really good is that they have a timeline with that. So in 2022, member states should start to present their proposals, and then in 2023, it will already be monitored and evaluated. So I think that, and also I think, you know, what's good on the actions that they will undertake is that it's multi-perspective. So they said education, but the labor market, housing, the digital world, legislation. So they took all kinds of perspectives into account. And now we have a plan to work with. and also a plan to work with for the members of the European Parliament.
Great, thank you so much. And with this, I think this is a question relevant to you all, but I will pose this to Jafar first. So in the European context, how prevalent is systemic racism in the penal system? So to what extent does systemic racism enforce the policing and sentencing policy in Europe? Does it at all?
So I think systemic racism definitely influences the penal system within Europe. I mean, speaking from a British perspective, the Lamy report, which was a report done a couple of years ago, trying to investigate systemic racism within British police force, found that people of color are more likely to receive harsher punishments for the same crimes. Now, the key reason behind this was because it was found that people of color are less likely to plead guilty than their white counterparts. Well, why is this the case? Well, it comes down from grassroots level policing. So things like stop and search. The fact that if you're a person of color, particularly if you're black or a brown male, you're more likely to be stopped. What that means is you're less likely to trust the police because you always see them as harassing you. Secondly, it's about the fact that police in Europe don't take racial crimes as seriously, or surveys have found that when people have tried to report racial crimes, police forces have often dismissed it or asked for a level of evidence which is very difficult to prove. So on that side, people then again begin to mistrust the police force. They see themselves simply being harassed and isolated from them. And what that means is when it comes to being tried in the justice system, when they are offered opportunities to plead guilty, they choose not to because of the systemic racism, because of the fact that most of the interactions with the police happens to be in a very negative way. And so they only have negative connotations about the police. And that in turn leads to, people of color receiving harsher punishments, which we were all aware how, prison is a cyclical nature. The longer you serve in prison, the less likely you're going to have a career afterwards or a better job. And therefore you end up more likely to end up in a cyclical nature of crime. So I think that's one of the key ways in Europe that systemic racism influences the penal justice system.
Great, thank you. And I would like to hear Ms. Raphael's thoughts as well, as she previously advised the Dutch police force on inclusion and diversity, and how maybe that can influence your thoughts on this question.
Yes, thank you. So the reason why I decided to work for the Netherlands Police was that I actually had a very critical discussion with someone who worked at the Netherlands Police. And before I worked at the Netherlands Police, I used to work a lot with the youth. I myself have a diverse background. I know how it's like to be discriminated and to do with racism. And I have many people in my surrounding who are dealing with it daily, but also especially young men with a migrant background who complained a lot and still are complaining a lot also in the Netherlands about the constant experiences that they have, that they drive a good looking car while they work very hard for it, and still a couple times per week they're being questioned by the police, like, how did you get that car? It definitely cannot be yours. I mean, look, it's extremely terrible. This is discrimination, this is exclusion. And that's why I started to work for the Netherlands Police, because coming from that critical discussion I had, I was being asked to work for the Netherlands Police. I decided to do that because I thought, well, let me try to change something from within the system. And I'm glad that I had the experience with the Netherlands Police advising on inclusion. And what I always said in my own police organization is that if you really want to strengthen the ties with your communities, then you need to start with yourself. You need to know, feel, and understand what inclusion is. If you cannot integrate that in your own profession, then it will be very difficult to connect effectively with local communities. And what I've seen in my experience, of course, is that there are some local communities also in the Netherlands that have difficulties with trusting the police. And that is very dangerous for the legitimacy of police organizations and the existing of police organizations. And that's what I've always been explaining. So I'm glad to see also that in the anti-racism action plan of the European Commission, that they definitely made a good statement about what needs to happen in law enforcement. So we also said that in our own resolution coming from the European Parliament, that there need to be trainings, programs, that there cannot be ethnic profiling anymore. We said that very explicitly, we said that very clearly. And also the European Commission wants European police authorities to work on this matter. Because what I find very, very worrying is that the extremism that we see in societies cannot be in our police organizations, for example. That's very dangerous, because this is about protecting the fundamental rights of people. So yes, we need to invest much more in the skills, in the competences of police officers. I also believe that during the recruitment and selection procedures, people need to be selected on very strong values and knowledge of their society. So I can sometimes not understand why some police officers became police officers. So yes, we need to exchange also on an EU level when it comes to best practices. During my work at the Netherlands Police, I also was in touch with colleagues and experts from the UK. That was a really good working relationship. And I also communicated with people from the US, being an expert on this topic. So we need to exchange much more.
Thank you. It was also very interesting to hear about your own experience as well. And so Kyla, I also wanted to ask this question to you as well, and see how this actually might be present in the United States. It is present in the United States, and also at the same time kind of follow up with a question, are there crimes that are not worth punishing but disproportionately target minorities, and how those two things play together?
Yeah, so I'll be brief for the first question, because I do feel like Jafar and Samira covered a lot of the basics. As you pointed out, I do think the US is unfortunately very notorious for the fact that people of color comprise a small portion of the US population, but more than half the population in prison systems. Part of this is a result of people of color more likely to plead guilty to get a shorter sentence. Also, racial profiling for crimes committed or even not committed, as well as just the general prejudice demonstrated by police officers, and legislations to support them, like Stand Your Ground. As far as the second question, if there are certain crimes that aren't worth punishing but disproportionately target minorities, one prominent example in the US, I think, would be the possession of paraphernalia, such as marijuana. In previous decades and in this past decade, Black individuals have been targeted for the possession of minor amounts. However, as we see in the US, it's a growing industry for individuals to capitalize on. So it's been interesting to see how the sentences for possession of this particular item has been reduced. However, we still have individuals that are incarcerated in prior decades for the possession of it. And there are sentences of about 10 years, 15 years for a possession of a certain quantity that now individuals walk around on the street with. So I am looking forward to see how the US penal system will look at this problem in the future, and hopefully to free those incarcerated for a similar problem.
Yes, thank you. And
maybe a last point.
Yes,
maybe
please.
a last point that I would like to make is that what we also know is that sometimes authorities they reject to investigate racial profiling. And that has also to do with not having diversity in their own institutions, having the right people raising the right questions in their own institutions and organizations. But I also believe that really needs to change. So when people experience racial profiling, that needs to be taken into account very seriously, and it needs to be part of the investigation. So we also need to improve that.
Thank you for that. Also then, I mean, I wish we had more time to keep discussing this, but I will start with some closing questions. So as Ms. Raffaella, you have said, and I thought this was very well said, that we need to feel inclusion within ourselves. And before making changes to society, it really needs to start internally. And so to start closing off, I would like to ask all of you, what do you think we can do in our day-to-day lives to combat systemic racism? And please, Ms. Raffaella, if you would like to start.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I'm very glad that we have such meetings, and I think we should do it more regularly to stay in touch and to keep each other posted. And you know, it's what I love about my job is that I can speak out. That's what I'm trying to do, at least speaking out and not leaving, you know, the elephant in the room. There is an elephant in the room, and we need to discuss that, and we need to be honest about that. And that's what I also encourage, you know, youth and the new generation to speak out and to do well, to make sure that you are well educated in terms of your own rights and the fundamental rights that you have. And we also need to make sure that that people will go to authorities to file a complaint, making sure that we have these cases, that we receive these cases. That's something that we really need to start working on a national level, on a local level especially. And what I've been also proposing during the last exchange that we had with the US delegation in the Committee on Human Rights is that I truly believe that we need to work on a joint EU-US action plan, making sure that measures like gathering data, investing in data, but also exchanging best practices, making new policies together, all these kind of activities should be part of that plan. But I think that we really need to work to a joint EU-US action plan, and I hope that will come.
Definitely hope so as well. Thank you. Kyla, would you like to give some final thoughts?
Sure. Similar to what Tamira said, I do think it's important to be aware of your own prejudice. A problem that I often encounter is that individuals will have amazing and wonderful intentions, but the execution of a question or action is poorly done. And so while the intention isn't malicious, you could easily offend because you aren't aware of your own privileges. Moving past that, as a student in higher education, I do want individuals to feel comfortable having those difficult conversations. And that's on both sides of the aisles for people of colors and their white counterparts. I'd rather you, and I say this all the time, get it wrong in the classroom and I'm able to provide feedback than you go out in the world and you say something that again could offend someone. So I think having patience and also being willing and owning up to the fear of asking those difficult questions is something that we all need to do.
Thank you so much. And Jafar, please.
I think one of the key things that we can do as individuals when it comes to fighting systemic racism is, first of all, educate ourselves about what it is, what exactly systemic racism is. Now, whether you're a person of color or not, you know, what we find is that through our education system, we inherently consume knowledge that creates a narrative where the way we view someone because of their race, you know, certain stereotypes, all of these things affect the way we act. It might be implicit biases. Some of these things are reading books by, you know, some really great authors, whether it be Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Bland Fanatics is another excellent book. And these books really highlight how the history of colonialism, you know, and have been whitewashed in a way. And that's, I think, one of the key ways we can help fight systemic racism. I think once we're educated about these topics, we were more likely to be open and willing to listen to people when they try to raise issues of systemic racism. So I think that, like, those are the two key things as an individual what we can do to fight systemic racism.
Thank you very much. And so I really enjoyed this discussion, and now we will start opening questions to the audience, and I will start reading them as they come in. So I will start with this one, and please feel free to, whoever just wants to start answering, feel free to go ahead. So it seems that racial tensions have increased in the last few years in Europe, France, for example, and in the United States. In a global environment, what does a comprehensive immigration policy look like in both Europe and the United States? any of you have any thoughts to that one.
I can begin. So currently the U.S. has, and is going through the proceedings right now, but currently the U.S. has a policy called the Migration Protection Protocols, originally known as Remain in Mexico. So while I can't speak to the European perspective, I can speak to the U.S. one. So within this protocols, individuals who are fleeing from Central America and South America, specifically from the Northern Triangle, so El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, and they're fleeing from whether it's domestic violence or gang violence or persecution as a result of their government. They're looking to come to the US and apply for asylum. However, with this policy, the US is forcing them to remain in Mexico and only come to the US for the immigration proceedings. However, the problems with this is not only that the Mexican government isn't able to adequately supply the public infrastructure and services that are readily available in the US. There's also the fact that these individuals, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, don't have appropriate legal representation. And so, as most of us know, that is what's going to make or break a case in immigration proceedings. So it would be my recommendation, obviously, to end the policy, but it also needs to be individuals willing to provide representation for them. I know there aren't that many, but it is an important step from a more local perspective. So from more bottom up rather than top down. So that's something that individuals can do. The US government is very entrenched in its views that plights and flights from Central America aren't deemed worthy. So I think in order for the US to formulate a comprehensive migration policy with regards to our neighbors south of us, we need to rethink the way in which we view what counts as deserving of protection, as well as just broaden our ideas of who deserves that protection.
Yes, I would like to respond from the European perspective. I think when it comes to the immigration policy, we are facing a big challenge right now in terms of making sure that we have an ethical and a humane system and policy working for people. It's really, I think it's very bad what's going on right now in terms of immigration in Europe, and it's very important that the European member states, but also the European continent, needs to make sure there's a way that we work together on protecting fundamental rights of people, giving also the basic facilities, making sure that people can participate, that they can follow education, and that they have a safe and a clean space to live in. And that's actually the challenge that we are facing now, dealing with an EU institution, the Council, that does not want to move on this topic. I mean, the European Parliament already has been very clear in how they think that that this system needs to look like. The European Commission did that, but it's stuck on the level of the Council. So if we really want to make sure that we create a breakthrough, then for the upcoming years, there's a lot of work to do, making sure that there is a comprehensive and a coordinated policy and a system that is mainly ethical and humane. And we should work on that quickly, because otherwise more people will end up being excluded, dealing with discrimination. And we are also dealing in Europe with a populistic movement, also populistic politicians, and the extreme right in Europe that is absolutely not working with us and contributing positively. So if we at the same time deal with people who do not have a place in our society, who do not have equal opportunities, then they remain very vulnerable, and also very vulnerable to the hate that is also coming up now in Europe towards people with this background. And we need to fight that, but we also need to make sure that we have a humane, good working migration system in Europe. We're not there yet.
Thank you. And I have another question that is also for MEP Samir Rafaela. As a member of government where you have to work and collaborate with other MEPs who perhaps have very different ideological views on these topics and are not supportive or are not entirely opposed or are entirely opposed to policies and actions that would begin to push progress on this matter forward. How do you approach such interactions, and is there a way to prevail in pushing these policies forward despite pushback?
Yes, thank you. And unfortunately, yes, we are dealing as being, progressive in the parliament. We are dealing with this conservative and very traditional way of thinking. In our own European Parliament, we have these movements, and it was actually one of the most important reasons. It was the most important reason for me to decide that, now is the time to get into politics, because I really wanted to have some control on it myself. And it's very important that in the European Parliament, like, for example, when we work on a resolution about combating racism in Europe, we see that we need to work with other groups in the European Parliament. We need to build strong coalitions. The Liberals, the Greens, the Social Democrats, that's a very strong bloc when it comes to these topics, when it comes to migration, when it comes to fighting racism and discrimination, when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to LGBTI rights. You see these groups being very progressive, and we need to do that together, because otherwise we end up weak against a minority, but it's a strong minority, and they're very vocal. And they're also starting to use narratives that we often use. They also speak about democratic values. They also speak about liberal values. They also speak about the protection of fundamental rights, but they mean it very differently, but they're using the same words. And that's also a dangerous development here. But they clearly have a different understanding of that. So we also need to work very hard every day in the European Parliament to make sure that we stay in control of our own narrative. What I'm trying to do myself is to always speak out, always making sure that I've been discussing this with groups, individuals, civil society organizations that can back up the message. That's very important. And building coalitions. That's how we do it now. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Staying in control of our own narratives, I think that is very important. And so another question from the audience: to what extent has the Black Lives Matter movement initiated a broader debate about migration and minority rights in Europe? Jafar, you haven't answered one. If you'd like to take that one first, please go ahead.
So yeah, I think Black Lives Matter movement has first of all invigorated the anti-racism movement within Europe in and of itself. It was an incredible thing to see this summer, the way, across the continent, we saw people in numerous countries standing up and, highlighting the issues that they have in these nations. I think the key thing when it comes to key thing about minorities and migration that is highlighted in the EU is when you've got migration camps like the jungle in France, and when you've got these fences in the south of Europe keeping out migrants in the way that they're being treated. The Black Lives Matter movement has clearly highlighted that it isn't enough to just simply not be racist, but rather one needs to call out that racism in their society and be anti-racist about these things. And how that's impacted migration is that we now view migration as, or we should start viewing, I think, as Samira said, migration as an issue of cooperation, the importance of cooperation within Europe to be able to deal with these issues. So I think the key thing is how it's increased salience on this topic throughout European nations, and how that, I think, hopefully will help policymakers in the future, or encourage policymakers to at least cooperate better on these topics, or in these issues, sorry.
Thank you. Either of you want to respond to that as well? then I will move on to another question. Oh, Kyla, please.
Okay. I think it is important to note, like as has been stated, that racism is not an American problem. It definitely exists in almost every country, which is why we saw protests of solidarity in Berlin, Amsterdam, Paris, and so on. However, events in America, so the protests here, especially after George Floyd's killing, prompts some in Europe to say, oh, well, things are better for Black people here because it's not the US, which one can make the argument for. However, what it does is it ignores Europe's colonial era and its own racist present. I do think that the conversation around racism is moving beyond American borders, like this event shows. However, it's important to consider the specific historical context when talking about minority rights as well as migrant rights. What's working for individuals from the DRC and Belgium is going to be different than Algerians in France and so on. So I do think that historical context truly plays an important role when talking about minority rights and then its relation to what's happening in the US.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and the question was about the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement on these issues, right? Yeah, well, so it had a major impact. We should not underestimate that. I mean, even in the resolutions that we voted on this year, we mentioned explicitly the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, and we can definitely not deny that this movement has shaken up the world. I mean, if you what happened after George Floyd, all these demonstrations worldwide. I took part with one of them in the Netherlands, and it was really amazingly impressive to see how many people showed up. And yes, I think that the Black Lives Matter movement had a major impact. What I could also see in the European Parliament is that it made a lot of my colleagues very aware of the urgency, and that might not have been happening if the Black Lives Matter movement would not have been that vocal and that effective.
Thank you. And so we might have time for one, maybe two more questions. But now there seems to be a growing anti-intellectualist movement among conservative white identifying citizens. Is this perception supported by your experience? And if so, what are current plans to address this sentiment? There was a short follow-up on this. This was, on the topic of Jafar Latif's urging of the populace to educate yourselves on these subjects. So whoever would like to start on this question.
So I think we are definitely noticing, in the last 5 years, this era of like calling things fake news if you don't agree with it, and anti-intellectualism. And I think it is a really dangerous thing, and I think you're right to point it out. And I think the key ways in combating this is, first of all, academics and people who are in higher education, the people who are in positions which they are more educated, is the way we communicate our findings, where we communicate our experiences. Now, this may be through literal day-to-day conversations. It's about speaking to your friends and family and highlighting them, because often your friends and family, they're more likely to be able to listen to you because you know them and they trust you. So it might just be the fact that you might consume these anti-racist books, you might take lessons from it, and then you might be the messenger and the best messenger for this message. So it doesn't always have to be intellectuals to provide the message to the masses, but rather it can be up to us as individuals consuming these messages and passing them on. I think that's going to be a really important factor, because like you've just said, people don't want to trust scientists the same way. People don't want to trust intellectuals the same way. And there's a lot of people believe in these massive conspiracies. In America, you've got the QAnon conspiracy theories, a lot of these things. So I think the most important thing really is making sure that these messages can come across different mediums, whether it be books or whether it be yourself in a normal conversation over the dinner table.
If either of you would like to respond to that question as well.
Well, what I would like to say from my own background, I mean, I graduated on radicalization and terrorism, and to be honest, it's not. What I already saw back then is that it's not new that there is extremism and radicalization also among these groups. And I think what has been very dangerous is that we've been neglecting it so long. We've been focusing a lot on different communities in which we see processes of radicalization and extremism. And yes, it's also there, but we neglected other groups that were already that were also in this process of radicalization. It's not something new. I know that from my study background. I know that from my study on extremism during my studies. And there were already warnings coming from researchers about this. So I think that what's very dangerous is that we keep neglecting it, and is that we keep it very, under the waterline. But that's dangerous for society. And we need to pay well attention to it.
Thank you. So a little different. Here's another question. What do you think about the difficulties for Muslim women who wear hijab to find a job or have access to education in some cases? Sorry about the fact. So what do you think about the difficulties for Muslim women who do wear the hijab to find a job, and about the fact that it can be required for them to take it off to do basic activities such as studying or working?
Yes, I'll go first. So that's wrong, because it goes into the liberal values that I have and the liberal view that I have. And everyone has the right, women have the right to wear whatever they want. And it's to me terrible to see how many Muslim women are being discriminated and excluded. My father is a Muslim. I grew up as a Muslim. And I've always embraced a very big part of my Muslim identity. And it's also very personal when we speak about Islamophobia. And it's very important that we discuss this much more, also on the institutional level and also in politics, because I think also gendered Islamophobia is often being ignored. And this is a worry that I have, because I speak a lot, of course, to Muslim women, and especially when it comes to Muslim women from who you can see that they practice Islam. They have experiences, and they tell stories about even violence that they experience in the streets. And we need to make legislation. We need to work on concrete measures to protect this specific group, and we need to address gendered Islamophobia much more. That's also what I'm doing from my membership of the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, and I'm very sharp on it, and I want to make sure that Muslim women can just decide whatever they want, and that they can wear whatever they want. It really goes into the liberal value that I have. Liberalism also means that you can just wear whatever you want.
Thank you. Jafar, please.
Just to quickly add on that as well, I think, as Samira said, that like gendered Islamophobia is a really, really, I think, misunderstood thing in Europe. The fact is, women are more likely to be very visible Muslim women are more likely to be very visible to others. The fact that they wear the hijab, that they wear the burqa or the niqab, and that often means that the target of discrimination on the streets. I mean, the fact, in France, very recently, we had 2 Algerian women who had slurs thrown against them and were, stabbed in a allegedly Islamophobic attack. And I think the key thing is I think, and Samira mentioned this earlier, is that when you've got the same different groups trying to use liberal values to justify very different arguments, it can become difficult. And I think this is where we have to embrace the narrative, because in certain countries you have this idea that liberalism means you can't wear the hijab because you're showing preference for a religion. But on the flip side, you can interpret liberalism to literally mean the ability for a woman to wear whatever she pleases to wear. And I think it's really important to remember about the importance of taking control of your narrative and realizing that just because someone throws out this democratic rights or these key buzzwords doesn't necessarily mean what they're attributing to these buzzwords follow. So I think that's really important to know.
Thank you. Kyla, did you want to comment on that?
Sure, super brief. Again, like everyone stated, I think it's wrong. Women should be able to practice their religion in whatever form that takes. Actually, in a recent study published by Stanford professors, outside of wearing the hijab, which also facilitates discrimination, there's also the fact that even seeing like a name on the resume then allows employers to either not hire them or hire them at lower salaries than their other religious counterpart. And so I think all of that is just to say that more needs to be done in this area for Muslim women and those practicing in general.
Thank you very much for that answer as well. And I believe we're running short on time, so we'll have to, I think that's all the time we have for questions today. So thank you to the panelists, Kyla, Jafar, and Ms. Rafaela for being here. And Ms. Rafaela, if you had any concluding thoughts that you wanted to give us, please.
Yes, thank you so much for having these conversations, and thank you also to Jafar and Kyla. It was really, really good to speak to you, and let's stay in touch also, because also for my work as a politician, it's very important to speak to people like you with your expertise and your knowledge on the topic. And what I would like to say is that, you know, we really need to protect fundamental rights of people together. This is not a one man or one woman show. We need to do this together. We need to build on coalitions, civil society organizations being extremely part of that. And I think that again, even though it's 2020, again, we see also today that's being confirmed that we are still not there. People are being undermined in their fundamental rights they have, and that's very, very unfortunate. And there should not be one day, 1 minute, 1 second that we don't spend time on it. So I really much encourage you to speak out, to do your research, to work on the topic as much as possible, because we all need to do this together, and we need to fight racism, and we will survive it, and we will win it.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody has learned something, or at least taken something away from this discussion. And with that, I want to thank once again MEP Samir Rafaela for joining us today. Thank you as well to my colleagues at European Horizons, Kyla and Jafar, for their insightful responses as well. And then lastly, I did want to thank my colleagues at European Horizons and the European Parliament Liaison Office for making this event possible. Thank you for everybody who attended today, and hopefully everybody can continue these discussions in their day-to-day lives. And with that, I wish everybody a wonderful day.
Thank you. Goodbye. Speak to you.